Professor Keach stands in solidarity with movements for justice on this campus, like few other professors I can think of. Please welcome William Keach.
I'm very proud to be able to introduce Norman Finkelstein tonight because in my mind, his work and his personal activism represents something very distinctive in the environment that we all find ourselves in now, an environment where trying to have an open and honest discussion about the long-standing and bitter conflict in the Middle East is very, very difficult to have. Norman Finkelstein is one of the most radical and hard-hitting critics of the official Zionist version of the Arab-Israeli conflict and of the historians who support this version. The book makes a major contribution to the study of the Arab-Israeli conflict and deserves to be widely read, especially in the United States. Especially in the United States. Please welcome Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for coming out this evening, and I look forward to a good discussion. The topic I want to talk about this evening is one which, the more I read on the topic, the more it becomes compelling to me, at any rate, that the Israel-Palestine conflict is probably among the least complicated, least controversial in the world today. The consensus on the historical record, the consensus on the human rights record, the consensus on the legal diplomatic record, basically the past, the present, and the future, is quite broad, and one can almost say it's remarkable. And now when I made that initial statement, some people laughed, because obviously it's quite at odds with the perception of the conflict when we enter into the public arena, where we're told how complex, how controversial, how intricate this Israel-Palestine conflict is, and what a tough nut it is to crack. I was on the way here reading a new book by one of the negotiators at Camp David, a fellow named Aaron David Miller, and he writes his account on the Camp David negotiations in 2000 and basically the whole period of the 1990s up to the present. And he goes on at some great length about how complicated this question is and how nobody would want to tackle it. But I don't think that's what the record shows. The record shows it's not very complicated at all. And then the obvious question arises, if what I'm saying is true, and the burden of my remarks this evening is to demonstrate what I'm saying is true, if what I'm saying is true, then how do you account for all the controversy that swirls around the Israel-Palestine conflict when you enter the public arena? And the main argument I'm going to make this evening is that most of that controversy is contrived. It's artificial, it's fake, and it's designed, its purpose is to divert people's attention from what the record actually shows and to sow confusion about that record. Well, let me begin with a fairly straightforward, accessible, and recent illustration. In July 2004, the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, it rendered a landmark advisory opinion on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. Some of you who are familiar with the topic will perhaps know the conclusion the World Court reached, namely that the wall Israel is building is illegal, that it has to be dismantled, and that Israel has to pay compensation for the damages wrought. In fact, that was probably the least significant aspect of the World Court advisory opinion. And the reason why is this. For those of you who are familiar with the lingo of this thing called the peace process, one aspect of this peace process is what's called the final status negotiations. And that basically means those aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict which are said to be so controversial, complex, and intricate that they have to be deferred, put off until the last stage of negotiations, because if you start with these issues, the whole process will break down. So the usual sequence is to claim we first need confidence-building measures, another catchphrase of this thing called the peace process. First we need confidence-building measures, and then we can proceed to those tough final status negotiations. Well, it so happens that before the World Court, the International Court of Justice, could rule on the legality of the wall that Israel has been building, they first had to rule on nearly all the final status questions. The final status questions are usually said to consist of four. Number one, borders. What are the legitimate borders of the state of Israel? What would be the legitimate borders of a Palestinian state? Number two, settlements. The status of the settlements that Israel is building in the occupied Palestinian territories. Number three, Jerusalem, the status of East Jerusalem. And number four, the question of the refugees. Well, it so happens that the World Court had to rule on the first three questions, borders, settlements, and Jerusalem, before it could rule on the legality of the wall that Israel is building, for reasons which will be obvious to everybody in the audience. If the borders of Israel extended all the way into the West Bank, tentatively or factually, then obviously the wall would be legal or tentatively legal. For reasons that every property owner in this room knows, if you have a quarrel with your neighbor, you're allowed to build a fence or construct a fence along the border with your neighbor, but you're obviously not allowed to build a fence around your neighbor's swimming pool or garage. These aren't particularly complicated questions of law, and the same principle applies here. So we have to first know where the border is before we can determine the legality of the wall that's being built. And the same principle applies to the settlements, because as it happens, the wall that's being built takes what the court calls a sinuous route that goes around the settlements. Well, if the settlements are legal, that's fine. But if the settlements are the equivalent of your neighbor's swimming pool, well, obviously questions arise. And so the World Court had to proceed to answer these questions. Allegedly, and you'll bear with me to the point of tedium, I hope, but because it keeps being said, these questions are so controversial. They're so complicated. Well, what did the World Court decide? Number one, on the question of borders. The International Court said there's a fundamental principle of international law. It's stated in the preambular paragraph of the famous UN Resolution 242, namely the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Basic principle of international law, said to be anchored in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. Therefore, Israel, which conquered the West Bank and Gaza during the June 1967 war, It acquired them by war. Therefore, Israel has no title to them. Why? Because it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. And so the World Court rules Israel has no title to any territory outside its pre-June 1967 border. And it's very clear it refers to the West Bank and Gaza as occupied Palestinian territory, capital O, capital P, capital T, and the abbreviation is usually OPT. I mention it only because it's considered now a commonplace. If you open up any human rights report in the occupied territories, you will see everywhere they are referred to as occupied Palestinian territory, paren OPT. It's a non-controversial question. They were acquired by Israel through war. Israel has no title to them. These are occupied Palestinian territory. They are not, as is often said in the public life, these are not disputed territories. These are occupied Palestinian territories. No dispute about the matter of ownership. I was reading today that Mr. Rumsfeld used to refer to them as the so-called occupied Palestinian territories, but it's not so-called and it's not disputed, says the World Court. Number two, the question of the settlements, the 460,000 settlers that Israel has transferred to the West Bank and previously to Gaza. What is their status under international law? Again, the World Court says it's just not controversial. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention states unambiguously, or as lawyers like to say, in plain language, that it's inadmissible for an occupying power to transfer its population to occupied territory. And therefore, the World Court says, quoting the United Nations Security Council resolutions, that the settlements in the occupied territory constitute a flagrant violation of international law. Full stop. Number three, we're often told that the question of East Jerusalem is, apart from the question of the refugees, the most complicated to resolve. And it's true, if you read the record of Camp David, it's probably correct to say that the refugee question, the Jerusalem question was the toughest nut to crack. There was a huge amount of energy invested in trying to resolve that particular question at the practical level. But legally, there is no issue at all. How did Israel acquire East Jerusalem? It acquired East Jerusalem in exactly the same manner as it acquired the West Bank and Gaza. It acquired East Jerusalem in the course of a war. And under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Therefore, Israel has no title to East Jerusalem. If you read the court decision, it's very explicit. It refers to the West Bank, comma, including East Jerusalem, comma, and the Gaza Strip as occupied Palestinian territory. No dispute, no question, no controversy, no complexity. Now, even that is really only part of the story. First of all, World Court, international court decisions are often quite close. It works basically like our own Supreme Court. Cases rise to the top, so to speak, because they bear on controversial issues which are close legally. That's why they reach the Supreme Court. And as everyone in this room knows, Supreme Court decisions are often quite close, as are our World Court decisions. So you take one which you would think is a no-brainer. Let's say 1996, Physicians for Human Rights submits a question to the World Court on the legality of nuclear war, or the use of nuclear weapons. I think the technical term was the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Now, the fundamental principle of the laws of war, as everyone in this room knows, is the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants. And it would seem to be pretty obvious that insofar as nuclear weapons are incapable of distinguishing between civilians and combatants by their nature, they're indiscriminate weapons. Insofar as they're incapable of distinguishing between civilians and combatants, you would think it's obvious they are illegal under international law, their use. No, the World Court was a very close vote, and the tie-breaking vote was cast by the president of the court. So even when you would think something would be fairly straightforward, it was not. I don't particularly agree with the decision of the court, but it was actually a quite interesting decision, and the dissents were, especially by this fellow Judge Viramantri, were very interesting to read. Why do I mention it? Because when you come to the World Court advisory opinion on these complicated issues to which I just referred, the vote wasn't close at all. It was 14-1. The one dissenting vote by the American judge Thomas Bergenthal, to which I'll return to in a moment. It was not a close vote. These are not, under international law, complicated questions. These are tenets, fundamental principles of international law, which were being tested in the advisory opinion. Or you could look at it from another angle. World Court decisions or opinions, when you take what's called the majority opinion, the separate opinion, the declaration, and the dissents, they can be quite substantial. So I was reading the 1984 World Court opinion when Nicaragua went to the court because the United States was mining the harbors of Nicaragua. People of a previous generation will remember that. When you look at the full compendium, separate opinions, majority opinions, and so forth, it comes to a hefty 1,000 pages. And one day in the past, when I was a professor, I got to late at night when no one was around to print it out on my university printer. Now I can't do those things anymore, unfortunately. But you got, they are quite hefty. What's interesting about this particular advisory opinion of the court, if you take all the opinions, and there were quite a few separate opinions, and Mr. Bergenthal's separate declaration, it comes to less than 100 pages. And it comes to less than 100 pages for a very simple reason. These are not complicated questions. Even you take the case of Judge Bergenthal himself. He does not issue a dissent. In the nomenclature of the court, you can issue majority opinion, separate opinion, and then the dissent, and in the middle is something called a declaration, the declaration being more neutral. Even the American judge, he was very cautious. He issues a declaration, not a dissent. And in his declaration, he begins by saying, there is much in the majority opinion with which I agree. And then he goes on to look at what's probably the most, not controversial, but most critical question, namely the issue of those settlements. Because where there are no settlements, there'd be no conflict. And Mr. Bergenthal says, well, I have to agree. Under Article 49, those settlements are illegal. And he says, if Israel is building the wall in order to protect the settlements, then he says, I'm using his language, ipso facto, the wall is illegal. And therefore, what we find is, on the most controversial questions, and of the most controversial of the controversial questions, it's 15-0 There's no controversy whatsoever. And that obviously raises, again, the obvious question. If what I'm saying is true, then how do we account for all of this alleged controversy swirling around the Israel-Palestine conflict? Before I look at that, I want to, in the time that allows me, which is obviously limited, to go through the record on the three areas which are the substantive areas of the conflict, to put in nursery school language, the past, the present, and the future. So let's first look at the past, the history. I notice in this room there are some people who are roughly of my age cohort. I can detect them from their tie-dyed shirts, their love beads, that glazed over look in their eyes, still saying give peace a chance, still wishing they were Sonny Bono with Cher. And for those who harken back to those wonderful days of the 60s, which are not over, they will remember that probably the question in the historical record that used to generate the most controversy, the most dispute, was how did those Palestinians become refugees in 1948? For those of you who are new to the topic, the background is fairly easy to sketch in. November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly decides to resolve this conflict in Palestine. We're going to divide it roughly in half between Jews and Arabs. Immediately upon the UN resolution being passed, a conflict breaks out within Palestine. By May 1948, when Israel declares its statehood, it becomes an interstate conflict with neighboring Arab states. At the end of the war, roughly 750,000 Palestinians find themselves outside their homes. And the question always arose, how did those 750,000 Palestinians, how did they end up refugees? And the standard argument that Israel put forth, and as I said, was probably widely believed up until roughly the late 1980s, the argument was that the Arab armies stood poised on the border of Palestine, ready to invade, transmitted these radio messages, broadcasts to the Palestinians in Palestine to leave their homes, clear the field for the invading Arab armies, and after they successfully threw the Jews into the sea, then the Palestinians would be able to return to their homes. How many people are familiar with that explanation of what happened in 1948? Well, the older people must surely, because that was standard. And until the late 1980s, as I said, that was pretty much what everybody believed. And then in the late 80s, a number of Israeli historians in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, Israeli historians started going through the record from the Israeli archival point of view. And the main person who went through the record is a fellow named Benny Morris. And Benny Morris concludes, to use his language, not my own, that what happened in 1948 was an ethnic cleansing. And there's now, you could say, a broad consensus among historians that exactly that, what happened in 1948, was the indigenous population of Palestine, at any rate in the area that became Israel, was ethnically cleansed. Now, it's not true to say no debate continues, but the debate is now within fairly narrow parameters. The debate now is, was this ethnic cleansing premeditated, intentional, methodical, or was it an accident of war? Everybody knows wars generate refugees, and maybe these refugees were simply a byproduct of a war. And to show you or to illustrate how narrow this debate has become, you take the case of Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, a very smart guy. He's a historian by training and a reasonably honest fellow for sure. He wrote a couple of years ago a book called Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, part of which went through the history of the conflict. And of course, he had to address the refugee question. And he says, well, yeah, it was an ethnic cleansing in 1948, but the former foreign minister says, I don't really agree with Benny Morris, Morris being one of the proponents of the notion that it was an accident of war. No, says the former foreign minister, I don't really agree with that. It wasn't an accident of war. It was quite clearly premeditated, intentional, methodical. As he puts it, it was anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer, transfer being the euphemism back then for expulsion. And so now you have the case of a former foreign minister, incidentally not an ancient former foreign minister. He was the Israeli foreign minister in 2000 during the Camp David negotiations. Even a former foreign minister and trained historian acknowledges it was not just an ethnic cleansing, but it was a premeditated ethnic cleansing anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer. Apart from the question of the refugees, probably the question that looms largest or is most in the public eye is the question of these wars that Israel has endured with its neighbors since its founding in 1948. And certainly it's a large number of wars, 48, 56, 67, the Canal War, 68 to 70, 73, 82, and then the two intifadas. And the conventional wisdom is, as Israelis like to say, with the possible exception of the 1982 war, the war in Lebanon, these were all wars of no choice wars. But that's not really what the record any longer shows. You take the case of a very excellent book. I highly recommend it. I certainly put it above my own, by Ze'ev Maoz. It's called Defending the Holy Land. Maoz is the former director of Israel's Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's a very smart guy, and obviously he held a prestigious position. That's their Israel's most distinguished Center for Strategic Studies. And he's written a very fat book. It's probably around 800 pages. It's interesting, not in any way to denigrate the book. I think the book is an excellent book. But just to put it in perspective, the book is mostly a synthesis of what all other scholars have written on the topic. It's mostly a synthesis of what you call, in scholarly language, of the monographic literature. He takes it all and tries to figure out, okay, what does it all show? Obviously, time doesn't allow me to go through those 800 pages, but it's not without interest to just listen to his conclusions. So he says, or concludes, Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. None of the wars, none, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, none was a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. The only possible exception, he says, and as I was actually interested, he qualifies it, the only possible exception is maybe 48. He goes on to say, Israel's decision makers were as reluctant and risk-averse when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels. When Israel was willing to take risks for peace, these usually paid off. the Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated formal and informal agreements. Again, an opinion diametrically at odds with the conventional or mainstream wisdom. 67 wasn't a war of necessity. 73, the so-called Yom Kippur War, not a war of necessity. The only possible exception is 48. Now bear in mind, under international law, if it wasn't a war of necessity, which is defined very stringently, a war of necessity is when you are the object of an armed attack. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. In any other case, it's a war of aggression. And even Mr. Maoz is clear in that. He says a war of choice is just a euphemism for a war of aggression. All of the wars, with the possible exception of 48, says Mr. Maoz, were effectively wars of aggression by Israel. Well, what about the present? Maybe the historical record has been clarified because it's historical. People have had a chance to go through the documentary record. But isn't the present complicated? It's happening as it unfolds, as it were, before our eyes. And often when you read the newspapers, we are told it's very complicated. Occasionally I have the stomach, if I can use that vulgarity, to look at the New York Times and this thing named Isabel Kirshner. She's their correspondent. And Ms. Kirshner is always in a state of perplexity and confusion. She never knows what's happening. So the last time Israel invaded Gaza, she says the Israelis say the majority of fatalities were militants, and the Palestinians say they were civilians. And then the proverbial hands are thrown in the air. Who knows who's telling the truth? But in fact, it's not so difficult to know who's telling the truth. All you have to do is do what's done in every other conflict. Namely, what do reporters, journalists do? They go to the local human rights organization, which has a track record of honesty and a track record of integrity, and you ask them. So the very day that Ms. Kirshner was throwing her hands in despair, who knows who's telling the truth, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, issues a press release saying we went through each of the casualties, and our conclusion, the majority were civilians. Now, it's a very interesting question with this matter of the human rights record, because on its surface, as the lawyers like to say, prima facie, you would expect there to be a lot of controversy. Why? Number one, human rights law is a relatively new body of international law. And that means a lot of the terms and concepts have not been really fleshed out and defined. One, for example, everyone in this room has heard, namely the term human shield. But what a human shield actually means is not entirely clear. Because, for example, let's say a city is under attack, and the defending country puts artillery next to civilian buildings because they have no alternative. It's, after all, a concentrated civilian area, a city. If it puts an artillery piece of artillery next to a civilian area, Is it using it as a human shield or not? It's a very tough call, and you'll see different human rights organizations reaching different conclusions about the same situation.